I am now Emeritus Professor at University of Washington. I've moved away from Seattle. I'm living in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, next door to my a daughter and her children, my grandchildren. It's very great. Incidentally, one of my grandchildren is spending the semester in Barcelona. I've asked her to send me text messages in Spanish. And I never studied Spanish, but I can read them mostly, but I have to try and get help. I have to look up some words. Okay. I'm interested, this presentation is about bias that is produced without awareness of producing bias. And there are two types of this. The implicit biases, which are the ones I've studied most, you may be aware of that, but just as important, perhaps more important, in explaining discrimination that occurs without awareness of engaging in discrimination is systemic bias. This is institutional procedures, laws, regulations, policies produce discrimination while people are just doing their business as usual and not thinking that they're doing anything out of the ordinary. I'll just give you one example of this. When on a job application, a person is asked to indicate whether they have a college degree, it's now recognized that that's sometimes very inappropriate, and it's well known that it does cause bias in selection because the college degrees are not distributed equally through the population. But there are many examples of systemic biases, and I'm not going to get into those other than just mentioning them here. Implicit biases are long-established mental associations, attitudes and stereotypes. Those are psychological terms, which I hope won't get in the way here. I'm trying not to assume much, if any, background in psychology, but these are associations that are established starting from very early years, meaning age 2, if not younger, and they lead to occurrence of discrimination in adults. And more than that, they prove very difficult to change. I'm going to ask 4 questions. I'm at the top, it asks you to raise hand for yes. I don't think I'm going to be able to follow that. So I will ignore that. And then let's not assume that you're going to be able to, that I'm going to know your answers to these questions. I'm wondering if how many of you have taken an implicit association test? I'll refer to that as an IAT hereafter at the Project Implicit website. Do you know of any remedies that are available to reduce or eliminate an implicit bias? Think about that for a second. Do you know how to fake an IAT to produce a result indicating that you have a bias opposite to the one that you may actually have? I'm not going to, I know how to do it. I don't think I'm going to have the opportunity here to show you how to do it. However, if you correspond with me afterwards, I'm willing to explain it. Does knowing that you possess one or more implicit biases help you to avoid being biased in judgments and behavior that might be affected by those biases? This is a difficult question. The answer is possibly yes, but not necessarily yes, because you have to do more than just know that you have an implicit bias. You have to have a strategy for keeping it from interfering and intruding on decisions and judgments that you make about people. Now, this is, and let me say in advance that I made this I don't have a great many slides. I made the presentation short in part because I wanted to get to answering questions that are of interest to you. And until last night, when a near truckload of questions arrived from Serena, I thought maybe I wasn't going to get any. But not only did I get questions, I got a whole bunch of good ones. And I'm not going to be able to answer all of them here, but I'm going to try to get to them soon enough so that I don't have to neglect them. Okay, this is an important question to me. Do implicit biases operate unconsciously or consciously? And the answer to this question is yes. They operate both consciously, unconsciously, and unconsciously, with the unconscious and conscious working together. Now, in one of the things I sent you, there is this diagram occurs as figure 2. This is an article on attempting to get implicit biases used more effectively in the courts in anti-discrimination law. This is the explanation, and I'd like to try to get you to understand it. That's based on a form of theory that was very widely used in cognitive psychology and social psychology, which is my field, in the late 20th century up until about 1990, when it began to be superseded by interests in neuroscience and in artificial intelligence. But this information processing stages analysis starts with sensation, which can be considered to be on the left side of this diagram, which leads to sensory perception and activates brain-stored memories that are related to what's being perceived. And these processes occur in series, and those two processes are followed by those occur automatically. They're followed by processes that occur consciously, reasoning and judgment. And while those are conscious and those actually lead to behavior, what's not recognized is the way in which the first two automatic stages influence the content of what is thought of consciously and its role in determining behavior. So this just repeats what I said. These automatic processes are formed in starting in early childhood. They influence and substantially affect the content of conscious judgments and reasoning and judgment that they are aware of, that we are aware of. I'm going to go on to try to convince you that, in fact, your conscious judgments can be influenced by automatic processes that you are not aware of. And there's a result that's known among perception psychologists as the McGurk effect. Conceivably, if you've taken an introductory psychology course or two, you've heard of it, but most people haven't. I'm going to illustrate it and exemplify it. And let's go on to, I'm going to show you, I'm going to animate this face very shortly, and I want you to watch this speaker who is a professor at UC Riverside who created this demonstration. A simple question for you. What do you hear him saying? And he will say it repeatedly. Is he saying ba? Is he saying fa? Or is he saying va? And I think this should work even for people who are primarily Hispanic in their Spanish speaking, but let's see. Possibly it won't. So is he saying ba, fa, or va? That's the question. And I have to start it.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay. because I really can't survey the class, the group. I'm going to guess that you heard either fa or va. That's what most people say in response to this. And I'm going to go on to show you another slide. Same person, but now he's two different images of him. And what I want you to do is switch between looking at the left face, the face on the left, and the one on the right, and see if you hear something different. I'd like to get some feedback on it. Maybe one of you can tell me what you're seeing or hearing.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, again, switch between looking at the left face and the right face and see if what you hear changes. Start it again.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay, I'm going to assume that when you were looking at the left face, you were hearing either fa or va, just like in the previous slide. And when you were looking at the right face, you are hearing only ba. Now, there's another way to test this, and I'm going to ask you to do that now. I'm going to start this again. And now I want you to do it by, not by switching between the faces you're looking at, but just by opening, just by
Ba, ba,
opening and,
ba.
excuse me. Just by opening and closing your eyes. Close your eyes and listen to him, and then open your eyes.
Ba, 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 ba.
Okay. Now I'm going to assume that, like most others, but not everyone, when your eyes were closed, you heard only ba. And in fact, you haven't heard anything but ba at any time, because that was the only thing that was being said in these slides. I hope that worked. And now I'm knowing that I don't have too much time left. I wanted you to see that so that you'd understand that something that seems puzzling, that what you hear being said is affected by something that you see, that is capable of overriding what you actually hear, so that you can hear a different syllable being said if you're watching the face that pronounces va or fa than the one that pronounces ba. Now, I'm going on now to your questions. So what has been the most, and I've got 14 questions on 2 pages. I'm going to try to speed through them to cover as much of them as I can. Let's see how well I succeed. What's been the most surprising or counterintuitive finding in my research on implicit bias? Well, I have to say the thing that was most surprising was the very first finding of that the IAT works and produces a measure that's was uncontrollable by me, that told me that I had a bias favoring white Americans' faces and names over Black American faces and names. And it wasn't something I could control. I didn't know that I had it, but after I had demonstrated it on myself multiple times, and I can tell you that I have taken the race attitude IAT hundreds of times over a span of 25 years or so, actually closer to 30, it's the same result still occurs. That's very surprising. But and this finding of the demonstration that I just showed you is also rather surprising and counterintuitive. But moving on, what steps can organizations take to reduce systemic bias without relying on individual behavior change? I outlined these in one of the two articles that I sent you. And I outlined a series of 6 steps towards the end of the article. So I'd encourage you to read that. But basically, the thing that is most important is that the decision makers in an organization need to decide that they are going to be able to reduce systemic and implicit bias only by assuming that they will occur unless steps are taken to prevent them from occurring. And that's outlined in the shorter article that I sent you on using implicit bias science in anti-discrimination law. Public health solutions often need big government backing to work. Do you think the US government would actually get behind policies aimed at reducing bias, or is that unrealistic? I am recommending in one of those two articles solutions based on public health. But I think the point that's made in the first, in this question is a real one. In fact, it's not going to work at the governmental level. And so my advocacy of public health solutions is at the individual organization. The whole problem with government involvement in this is that one government agency does the research and another carries out the policies, and the research doesn't influence the policies. So yes, government can be a problem here. How can you work on knowing that you have implicit bias and not letting that affect what you are doing and how you are treating others? This is a very difficult question. And I'm going to repeat what I have already started to say, is that if you know that you have implicit bias and you want that not to influence your judgment, you have to find a way of preventing the bias from operating. And this, if you're making decisions about other people, whether you're a teacher or an employer or a supervisor of any sort in work, you need to avoid making subjective judgments in which you're just saying, well, taking everything I know, what do I think of this person? I'll come up with a rating I pick a point on a 5-point scale, ranging from not succeeding to succeeding outstandingly. That's not the way to do it. Develop objective criteria. Instead, develop objective criteria for doing the evaluation and make sure that you get the data that indicate objectively how the person is doing. And so in teacher grading papers, grade them without knowing the student's name. That is almost invariably possible and not too difficult to do. How long do you think it would take to flip biases? For example, associating women with career and men with the family, opposite of what I wrote. Well, actually, it's actually opposite of what the IAT shows. And the answer to that question is, it might take forever. We do not know of good methods for reversing implicit biases. And God knows I have tried to reverse my own, and I don't trust myself to do that, even though I have been aware of this having implicit biases, not just in the race domain, but in almost every domain in which they exist: age, gender. Old people, such as myself, are biased against old people, and the IAT shows that very strongly. Why is it not possible to conduct true experimental tests that could establish the interpretation that implicit bias is a cause of discriminatory behavior? Very good question. I think I answered that somewhere, maybe in one of the two articles I sent. But the answer is that implicit bias, it has to do with implicit biases being established so early in life. They start to form by age 2, if not before. There is no way that you can randomly assign influence, ethically, that you can randomly assign infants to experimental conditions before age 2 and implement interventions. Parents shouldn't allow it. Psychologists shouldn't allow it. It's just not possible, at least not now. Do these biases stem from your environment, or does it have anything to do with genetics? Well, I obviously, I think that they are environmentally established, but that doesn't mean it has nothing to do with genetics. I think everything we do has something to do with genetics. It just, we don't know how genes are involved in implicit biases, however. Okay, that's 7 of the 14 questions. I hope I'm doing all right, so I can just go on to the next 7. If implicit bias is described as an unconscious behavior, will it ever truly be eliminated? And my simple answer to that question is, well, not in my lifetime, I'm sure. I think their being eliminated requires change in society, change in culture, in institutions. And it's not that it's impossible, but at present it is difficult to see that those who are in a position to make changes that will influence what influence the experiences that infants and toddlers and young children have. There's nothing that's going to change that now. So I'm not optimistic about it being eliminated anytime that might be considered soon. This is asking about a diagram that I showed you before when I was talking about the McGurk effect. The theoretical information processing stages formulation. Has that framework changed as you've researched more throughout the years? Well, the answer is that framework that I presented there was essentially intact and developed as it is understood now, more than 40 years ago. However, I have changed in the thinking that I described to you about how unconscious processes are influencing conscious choices and decision making. And when I was introducing the McGurk effect, that's a change in my thinking about how the information theoretical framework can be applied. And that's developed only relatively recently. How can the higher educational and professional business systems change their approach to diversity training and bias reduction programs to be ahead of the law and science systems? At times, I've seen more change to a program in higher education setting than I have in business trainings. It's a good question. I think I have to answer this one as I don't know, but I do think that the essence of it is to put people who are like epidemiologists working in a university environment to examine statistically the disparate impact of current university and business policies on outcomes to demographically different groups of students, workers, etc. I think that's a route that should be used and is not frequently adopted. I tried to get University of Washington interested in doing things like this, and I regret to say that so far I have pretty much totally failed at it. What steps can organizations take to reduce systemic bias without relying on individual behavior change? Well, I think it's administrative changes at the higher ups in the organization start using systematic procedures to assure that subjective influences and or influences that can create, that allow implicit biases to operate, are not allowed to operate. Not easy to do. How can scholars reasonably contribute to anti-discrimination interventions being widely tested practice? Do you think interventions merit research, even if past work has suggested that many are ineffective? The answer to that second question is proposed interventions should be studied. I'm not optimistic about finding ones that work. I don't know how scholars can reasonably contribute to anti-discrimination interventions being widely tested practice. I just told you that I haven't failed very, whoops, excuse me. I haven't succeeded much in doing that. Next to last question. Why do you think discrimination can be so hard for some people to recognize? Similarly, why do some people tend to resist identifying discrimination in their lives around them? This is a great question. And I do agree with the premise of the question that discrimination can be very hard to recognize. I have certainly suffered from anti-Semitic bias in my life, but do I recognize it when it's occurring? I generally don't. When my college applications were being evaluated by Yale University, they had a systemic practice of accepting only a maximum of 10% of Jewish people into their students. That wasn't known about it for about 20 or 30 years later. And people who are discriminated against, and I assume this includes Hispanic, Latino people, probably have almost as much difficulty demonstrating and almost as much difficulty concluding that they are being discriminated against when they are than I have ever had on the basis of my being Jewish. Are there ways that students and scholars can advocate for disparity finding quantitative research within institutions? Do you see this change being reasonable within institutions like the UW? The answer to that is yes, there are ways, and I would love to see students and faculty and workers organized to implement some of the changes in administration that would definitely reduce both systemic and implicit bias. Do I see this change as being reasonable within institutions like UW? I see it as being reasonable, but I don't see it as being done. Okay, I'm about at the end of my time. I wanted to, I'm putting up on the screen the information that if you log into Project Implicit, which is implicit.harvard.edu, you can take an implicit test, implicit association test, and there is a Hispanic test, an attitude test that you will find there. I, along with many others, can be said to fail that test in that I show a bias favoring non-Hispanic Americans over Hispanic Americans when I take that test. And this is a very interesting test for many of you to take because many of you may show that same bias. I do know that African Americans take about 50% of African Americans show an implicit bias favoring white over black. You go on, where clicking the button that says take a test or the menu item, and you get a display like this. There are about 20 tests available. They are randomly ordered when they show up. This shows what some of the most commonly ones taken at the top, but notice the Hispanic American IAT that showed up on this list. I had to actually load this page a few times before it showed up on the first sheet, but I encourage you to take it if you haven't already done that. It involves classifying words and names. So you just have to be able to reliably characterize or categorize Perez, Garcia, Vargas, forgive me for my lack of Hispanic accent, Guerrero, Lopez, Ramirez, as Hispanic, which I can do very easily, and Kelly, Wallace, Jones, Smith, Thompson, Andrews as European American. And then these words above, delight, friendship, etc., hatred, hurtful, etc., as either good or bad. Very easy tasks to do, and that's all you have to be able to do to take the IAT. I must be almost at the end because I put a blank page in here. Yeah, I want to encourage you to contact me if you have any questions that weren't answered or about anything else that can be helpful to you in the work that you want to do. So it's because I am old and got my IAT address at UW assigned circa 1986, so almost 40 years ago. I was able to put my initials into my, without having to have a number after it. And I want to suggest careers you might consider. Don't have time to, I think I'm at the end of my time now, and maybe there are some more questions if there is more time. But the two articles that I sent are encouraging you to go in the direction of public health, where if you develop some epidemiological skills, you could actually collect data, analyze data, and hopefully get in a position where you can influence organization leaders that they have disparities. This is exactly what I have tried to do at University of Washington with the most limited success. It's been done in a very few domains, or law. I have become a legal expert on discrimination, implicit bias and discrimination, and I testify in discrimination cases. This is something that if you are inclined to go into law, you could pursue. It is not difficult to do, and I'm looking to help train people who want to do this. I am doing this now. This has been my main business since I became emeritus, retiring from regular teaching and research at UW. So that this is my business now. I think that's the end. So I hope you found this interesting and hopefully motivating. And I again thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to talk. I think I'm at the end. Yes, I am. So I'm going to stop the sharing now.
Thank you, Tony, for sharing with us more about implicit biases. I'm going to let the students, if anyone has any additional questions, we do have some time. So I'm going to allow for anyone that would like to ask Tony any questions about anything on the presentation. We have about 10 minutes. You can also write in the chat, and then we are more than welcome to read those out loud.
Yeah.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
It's very faint.
You hear me there?
Yeah,
Better?
that's better.
So, what are your I don't know, what tips would you give? Like you said, and everybody kind of kind of aware that it's really hard for people to see their biases, their implicit biases. And this, like, the way the world is right now, how would you go about it to talk to someone who's like, they can't see their privileges? Like, how do you make it without making it hostile conversation because they get so defensive so quickly? And I think that I would love some like tips on how to make the conversation in a way that the person doesn't become hostile quickly.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have very good advice for you on that. I think the maybe you should just back off, recognizing that there's almost no way you're likely to succeed, and maybe talk to their friends, their parents, their children, or someone else who might influence them. But I think you raise a good question, and one for which it would be great to have a good answer to. But I think one of the points I made toward the end is that it's difficult for people to recognize when they are being discriminated against, but it's also even more difficult for them to recognize when they are discriminating against others, when the discrimination is due to systemic or implicit bias. There are people who have explicit biases and they know damn well that they're discriminating, and that's what they want to do.
Thank you.
I had a question, if there's still a little bit of time. So is there a way to measure whether the amount of implicit bias that a person tests for, is it affected by their own upbringing? For example, if they, regardless of background, grew up in a very diverse or multicultural environment, would they be less likely to test highly for implicit bias? Or is there no correlation or connection?
You know, this is again in the category of great questions, which means I don't have a good answer to it. But the yeah, I mean, the research on influences on children that affect their biases is difficult to do. I tried to do some of it by asking people who were taking implicit association tests at the Project Implicit site to answer some questions about what they remember of their early schooling experiences and early family circumstances. And I found some questions that actually did show correlations with adult measured implicit biases. The correlations were in a way disappointing because they were very weak, but that in itself is not, I mean, that's not too surprising. And I've actually, observing this prompted me to write an article saying that very small correlations can be of immense social significance when they apply to very large groups of people, which is the case in discrimination. So this is definitely worth studying, but this is, you people listening to this, at least some of you are young enough, most of you are young enough, so you might have time to do something about this, and I would encourage you to look for ways if you get interested in that.
Sorry, I'm making sure you'll hear me. Sorry.
Yes.
Okay. So mine kind of correlates to the question I asked on the paper. Within higher educational settings, could, especially when focusing on like organizational theory and building a community, can some of like, if we're learning about implicit biases and also like helping others in our groups, per se, like I was student leader in groups and we were always working on implicit biases and like dismantling what we had learned as children, could that still continue in these groups as long as others in like the director spaces are also willing?
Yeah, I'm reluctant to encourage people to use methods that haven't had research demonstrations of effectiveness. And because I know of almost nothing that has had a research demonstration of effectiveness, and some of the ones that have had research demonstrations of effectiveness prove out not to be reproducible findings. I'm not encouraging people to try to develop interventions, even though I regard it as conceivable that, you know, maybe some brilliant person will indeed come up with and demonstrate some method that is capable, as one of the questions put it, flipping implicit biases. I'm not at all optimistic about that now, and I gave up trying myself because I couldn't think of anything that I felt confident had a good chance to succeed. So I think the way to proceed, if you want to eliminate implicit biases, is to when you have advised people that when they have decisions to make, find a way to make those decisions on the basis of objective evidence. Don't rely on subjective impressions or your best judgment based on everything you know, which is sometimes just a way of tossing or passing it on to subjectivity. I know I sound pessimistic, and I am, but I don't think the efforts should be abandoned.
We have about maybe a couple more minutes for one last question, if any students wants to ask anything.
Yeah, since the floor is open, I figured I would ask. I checked out the Harvard website for the implicit bias test, and it looks like a lot of them are geared toward American ethnic groups and demographics. Is there research that demonstrate differences in other contexts, like Europeans would have their own biases against one another or other groups of people, for example, or in like Latin America, like the racial test, I feel like it would be structured differently. I'm wondering how reproducible is this in other contexts?
Great question, and I have a somewhat encouraging answer to you, because sites like the Harvard site or parallels to it exist in numerous other countries and in other languages, and some of these are South American countries or European countries, Asian countries. And you're right that the ones on the US side are a selection of tests that are in some ways mostly appropriate for American audiences. So it involves contrasting white with other groups. That's less so in some of these sites in other countries.
Is there any differences in implicit biases among like different continents in the research? Like, are Americans more biased than Europeans, for example, or is there not enough like correlation to be able to say anything definitive?
Yeah, surprisingly, and this surprised me too, there are the white-black difference holds up in almost all countries. I don't know that we have, Africa is definitely underrepresented in the testing that is available. So I don't know if anyone has written an article reviewing tests on black-white race discrimination, implicit bias in an African country. And that may just be that I haven't looked at it, been looking for it recently, because a great amount of stuff appears. But surprisingly, just as one example, and this may have to be the last one, I assumed that age was more venerated in Asian countries, particularly Japan and China. The implicit association test does not show that at all. And I should add that I have a very good anti-old IAT result also. And they don't study people much older than I am. So there we are.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights today.
You're very welcome.